Hello, this is JOMAJ Studios, and this is our original fantasy action adventure, The Fall of Nale. Episode 19. The Wrath of 6 Kings. The flash of blinding light finally passed, and Luke found himself on the floor, covered in dust, in the middle of a dark open field, surrounded by half a dozen cave lions. Luke slowly got to his feet as the snarls and growls of the powerful animals echoed through the air. One of the lions suddenly attacked from behind, causing the son of Jacob to react by somersaulting backwards over the creature and unwittingly using the head of another lion for leverage to jump further out of reach from the attacking beasts. As the young warrior touched the ground, he immediately went into a backward roll, narrowly escaping the prospect of being torn into shreds by 3 hungry lions, while spotting a portal open 15 feet up in mid-air over the ferocious beasts area. Luke, determined not to get trapped in the dimension, ran towards the cave lions that were more than pleased to oblige the gesture by pouncing right at him. As the lions leaped up, so did he. With the use of incredible agility, Luke began jumping on and off each of the attacking lions' heads to gain height and distance towards the gateway. One of the lions jumped several feet higher than its fellow beasts and was on a collision course with the young warrior. Luke, now very focused, avoided facing the beast's power head-on by executing in mid-air a frontward somersault and kicking the back of the creature's head, gaining enough momentum to thrust himself through the portal, with only 1 second to spare. Thank God not all birds can fly. Meanwhile, Lance found himself lying in the shallow end of a beautiful stream. Where the hell am I? Lance asked himself as he got up and noticed the beautiful countryside that surrounded him. Lance got onto dry land, unsure of what his next move should be. What the? Cried out the young warrior as hundreds of terrified sheep stampeded past him. Lance looked in the direction the sheep were running from and sighted a giant multicolored bird that was heavily built and flightless with a long orange razor-sharp beak, which he used to pick up and gobble down sheep that were not fast enough to get away. As the bird spotted Lance, he gave out a loud shrieking sound out of some form of excitement and began to run right at the young warrior. Lance, acting quickly, avoided the bird's attacking beak by rolling under the bird before taking to his heels and running as fast as he could. But the young warrior soon found he was running towards a dozen more large and bizarre-looking birds. Lance, determined not to be bird food, drew out his father's sword and ran back towards his original assailant. The giant bird wasted no time in thrusting its beak at Lance, who in turn shattered it with his father's enchanted sword. The young warrior then decapitated the bird with an unforgiving aerial sword assault. As his feet touched the ground, Lance continued to flee from the large carnivorous birds behind him. As the flesh-eating birds were on the verge of catching up with the student of Jacob, blocks shone down on him, and a portal opened right in front of him. Wasting no time, the blonde-haired warrior leaped right through the gateway. The ugly sadist. Luke fell out of the portal in the middle of a muddy ditch. The young warrior crawled out of the ditch and got to his feet, only to find he was in an unknown forest surrounded by a night sky. Luke for several minutes wandered through the forest, when to his pleasant surprise he saw a portal open about 10 meters ahead of him. The young warrior, aiming to reach the gateway before it closed, began running towards it. But before he could jump through it, a giant beast crashed through the trees and jumped in between him and the portal. The beast was white and hairy with red eyes. It had the upper body and head of a rodent, only its arms were ape-like, while its lower body area was similar to that of a kangaroo. As Luke stopped in his tracks, he caught sight of the portal closed behind the creature. The creature then put on an evil grin and began to mercilessly attack the son of Jacob. Luke put his agility into full swing and was still only just about able to avoid the creature's attacks. The beast attacked with its head, teeth, feet, paws and tail, but Luke's determination to survive prevailed. At one point, the creature attempted to strike Luke down with its version of a dropkick, but Luke acted quickly and rolled right under the attack. As Luke got to his feet, he drew out the short swords given to him. The creature smiled as it unleashed 2 sets of claws, which were at least 10 inches long. The monster then gave out a loud, roar-like sound as it moved in for a second round of attacks. Luke, in 3 artistic movements, shattered the creature's claws with the weapons in his hands and drove the blade of one of his short swords into the creature's sternum area. The beast gave out a loud roar as its life force began to fade, and a blinding flash of light followed. Water breached both the hosts of life and destruction. Lance fell out of the other side of the portal onto a large wooden plank that was floating in the middle of an ocean, which was not of this world. While the sun shone brightly, the blonde-haired and blue-eyed warrior got to his feet and noticed he was surrounded by hundreds of wooden planks that just seemed to be floating aimlessly. As the young warrior looked around, he spotted an island that was 400 meters up ahead. Water around him began to rustle as flesh-eating piranhas began to eat away at the plank he was standing on. in an effort to get to him. With the sole aim of staying in one piece, Lance began heading towards the island by jumping from plank to plank, at the same time avoiding thousands of piranhas. After covering about 200 meters, the young warrior noticed a portal open on the island. Lance then began to quicken his pace, but his efforts were in vain, for by the time he got to the island, the portal closed. "Now what?" yelled out Lance, frustrated at the position he was in. Immediately the young warrior uttered those words, a gigantic blue, carnivorous, prehistoric whale raised half its body out of the water, at the same time giving out a loud shrieking sound. "I had to ask," said Lance quietly as he drew out his father's sword to take on the 30-foot monster. The sea monster in one quick motion thrust his head at Lance in an effort to take a bite out of him. Lance reacted by executing a straddle jump, at the same time striking the creature in the eye with his father's sword. The creature, now in a lot of pain, gave out a loud shrieking sound before finally submerging back into the water. Lance, who was now on edge, readied all his warrior instincts as an unsettling silence followed. Suddenly, the whole island began to quake as the sea monster came crushing out of the island's sandy floor. Lance, taken by surprise, decided to fling his sword at the large beast. The blade of the enchanted sword dug deep into the beast's throat area. The monster, that now couldn't even scream, began fighting for its life as it lost the ability to breathe. Lance leaped up in an effort to grab hold of his father's sword, but halted as a flash of white light blinded him. Sometimes running isn't an option. Luke regained his sight, only to find himself on his hands and knees in the middle of an empty, rocky landscape. The son of Jacob got to his feet, bracing his warrior instincts for the worst. 5 meters to his right, he spotted a large and heavily built man, dressed in only a small piece of animal skin. His persona was primitive and animalistic. 5 meters to his left, he sighted the gateway out of the dimension open. Luke didn't bother attempting to make it through the portal, for his instincts told him somehow the primitive man wouldn't allow him. The young warrior stood his ground silently until the portal closed. Almost as if the portal's closing was some kind of signal, the wild man ran at Luke with the intent to crush him with his bare hands. As the cave-like man got into distance, he began to continuously swing his fists at the young warrior. Luke dodged each of the wild man's bone-crushing attacks with ease. After about a minute of trying to hit Luke, the wild man attempted to tackle the young warrior to the ground. But again, Luke was too quick for him and was able to avoid the attack by spinning out of the way. As the wild man turned round to continue his assault, Luke greeted him with a right and left hook, which he followed up with a powerful roundhouse kick. As the wild man staggered back, Luke took to the air and struck him continuously with his feet across 4 meters. The wild man landed on his back, while the young warrior landed on his hands and knees. The primitive attacker got to his feet and ran at Luke, with the sole intent of attempting to grab him. The son of Jacob responded by getting to his feet and running away. Then, taking his opponent completely by surprise, Luke leaped up in the air and ricocheted backwards and struck the wild man in the neck with his fist. The young warrior immediately followed up his attack by spinning his entire body in mid-air and striking the wild man with an aerial kick, which in turn flung the primitive assailant violently to the floor. Luke again landed on his hands and knees, this time backing his opponent. The wild man got to his feet and gave out a loud cry as he metamorphosed into a 12-foot beast that was half man, half rhino. Luke, somehow sensing his opponent's transformation before even taking a look, drew out Prince Nathaniel's short sword before facing his opponent once again. The walking monstrosity charged at Luke, who in turn leaped out of the way. The beast, now able to follow Luke's movement, tried keeping up the attacks by attempting to crush him with his hands, feet and body. Luke was able to stay out of harm's way, mainly with rolls and flips. At one point, Luke ducked under a steel-denting fist, at the same time slashing the monster across the belly. The creature staggered back and cried out in pain. Luke maintained his attacking distance by following the creature with a butterfly kick. The young warrior then proceeded to slash the beast again and again across the monster's arms, legs, back and chest, until finally he drove the blades of his comrade's short swords into the creature's chest. This caused the beast to scream loudly. Luke, unable to show the monster any mercy, drop-kicked the short swords right through its chest. As Luke watched the beast's demise, the young warrior made a move to pick up his comrade's weapons, but was stopped by a blinding flash of white light. No time to think. The blinding flash of light passed, and Lance found himself standing in the middle of a large sand pit, at the center of a deserted sandy terrain. "The sword," said Lance to himself, noticing he was no longer in possession of his father's weapon. But before any form of panic could set in the young warrior, his father's enchanted sword literally fell out of the sky and into the sandy ground in front of him. Lance, more relieved than surprised, pulled the sword out of the ground. As he put away his sword, Lance noticed a dozen men surrounding him armed with sharp axes. The hostile-looking men very much resemble ancient Indian warriors from the Wild West area. One of the men gave out a loud battle cry, using a high-pitched tone, and then they all began to charge at Lance from all angles. Lance, without even thinking about it, drew out his father's sword and began to defend himself. Despite the fact that he was outnumbered 12-1, Lance still proved to be more than a match for his attackers. As Lance struck the 12 warriors one by one, they all broke down into sand. After Lance struck the last throw, he began to scramble out of the pit. As the young warrior climbed out of the pit, the sandy remains of the warriors came alive and swooped their way out of the pit in form of a sandy whirlwind. The students of Jacob made it out of the pit, only to be confronted by this whirlwind. The sand whirlwind then split into 6 parts and transformed into 6 large hyena-like wolves. Lance, trying not to show any fear, slowly began to back away from the flesh-eating beasts. Fate then took the young warrior's side as a portal opened smack in the middle of the pit, and it was at this point the wolves decided to attack. Lance reacted by somersaulting backwards and diving through the portal. All the wolves leaped through the air after him, but only 2 of them made it through the gateway. A little bit of space makes all the difference. After the flash of light, Luke found himself standing in an area that seemed just enough to contain him, with only one ray of light shining into it. The walls around him were rocky, like the side of a mountain, and stood over 100 feet high. Luke, feeling slightly claustrophobic, looked around for a way out, but it seemed the only way to move was to climb up. As the young warrior stood indecisively about how to move, a large razor-sharp claw came smashing through one of the walls, missing Luke's face by just an inch. Now motivated, Luke, utilizing his agility, began to make his way up the wall with an incredible pace, while a giant prehistoric bear wolf came smashing through a wall. The beast then began to intensely pursue the young warrior up the wall. Luke got to the top of the wall, only to find the hole at the top was much too small for him to pass through. Luke then looked down to find the bear wolf closing in on him. Luke, acting quickly, drew out one of his short swords and threw it at the approaching monster. The blade of the sword dug deep into the creature's forehead, causing it to plunge towards the ground. The monster didn't hit the floor, instead it fell through a portal that opened underneath it. Luke attempted to jump through the portal, but was blinded by a flash of lights. Unfinished business. As Lance fell out of the portal into a countryside-like scenery, he drew his sword out in mid-air to defend himself against the hyena wolves that fell out with him. The young warrior's efforts to ready himself for battle proved to be futile, as one of the hyena wolves pinned him to the ground before he could gain momentum to make use of his sword. The beast then made a move to literally tear the young warrior apart. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a large entelodont beast came out charging, knocking the hyena wolf off Lance. The force of the entelodont's attack caused the hyena wolf on the young warrior to be flung into its fellow beast, causing both of them to shatter into sand. Lance, having no time to retrieve his sword, rolled out of the way of one of the entelodont's feet that had attempted to crush him. While Lance was nimbly staying clear of the entelodont's attack, the sandy remains of the hyena wolves came alive and transformed into a giant hand. The giant hand then grabbed hold of the entelodont and tossed it more than 200 feet up into the air. As the prehistoric beast landed back first onto Lance's sword, it embraced death almost instantaneously. The sandy hand then transformed into a man that very much resembled Lance. The man then dispersed some sand out of himself and used it to create a hard wooden stick, which he then proceeded to use to display all sorts of rotations before finally stopping in a combat stance. Lance smiled and took out his nunchucks, which he then used to also display some rotations before finally stopping in a combat stance of his own. The man attacked, causing him and the young warrior to engage themselves in combat. Using a style adopted by only the most gifted warriors, Lance kept the man's attacks at bay with an artistic form. At one point, Lance managed to hit the man's stick off course with one nunchuck and strike him in the face with another. The man's face shattered into sand as he got struck, but the headless body regrouped instantly with a body spin and transformed its stick into a whip. While the Sandman made sure Lance was on the receiving end of his whip, he reformed another head. Lance, making use of his natural acrobatic skills, managed to dodge every one of the man's whip attacks until it finally grabbed hold of his leg. As Lance was pulled towards his opponent, he gathered leverage and struck the Sandman, who in turn shattered into sand. The sandy remains then regrouped and reformed the man, only this time he was armed with a sword. The Sandman wasted no time in attacking Lance with a series of devastating attacks. Lance, staying out of harm's way, cleverly led his attacking opponent towards the dead entelodont. The Sandman ended up slicing the dead dinosaur in two while trying to destroy Lance. This allowed Lance to grab hold of his father's sword and even up the odds. The Sandman and Lance then fought intensively. However, Lance intentionally made no move to strike his opponent. Then a portal opened, and Lance disarmed and struck the Sandman, causing him to shatter into sand. This gave Lance more than enough time to leap through the portal and leave his sandy threat behind. The art of survival. The light passed and Luke found himself standing on a giant block of concrete that was suspended in mid-air. The young warrior looked around and noticed he was surrounded by floating blocks of concrete, under which was a lake of fire, as vast as the Earth's ocean. Luke, focused on leaving the dimension alive, began to visually scout the area. Then, to his surprise, a portal opened in front of him. But before he could make an attempt to jump through it, the concrete block on which he stood began to crumble. This caused Luke to somersault backwards and land on a neighboring concrete block behind, which also began crumbling immediately after his feet touched it. The young warrior, led by his survival instincts, found himself jumping from block to block and moving further away from the portal. To make matters worse, dozens of razor-sharp discs, which could easily cut a man in two, began shooting towards the young warrior from an unknown source. Luke's mental and physical abilities was put to the test for almost 12 minutes, before finally he jumped onto a concrete block that was the size of a football pitch, where he immediately rolled out of the way of an attacking ball and chain. Luke found himself dodging the attacks of a saber-toothed tiger that stood like a heavily built man of about 9 feet. The mutant creature gave out a loud roar as it swung its giant ball and chain at the young warrior. As Luke dived over the assault, he thrust his spear-headed chain into the face of the saber-toothed attacker. Luke's effort blinded the creature in one eye, causing it to drop its weapon and stagger back. Luke, wielding his spear-headed chain in an artistic motion, began to slash up the mutant's face continuously until it fell off the block of concrete into the lake of fire. As Luke looked over the edge to watch the creature's demise, a flash of light blinded him. Desperation is definitely a motivator. Lance fell out the other side of a portal and found himself face to face with a giant armadillo the size of an elephant. It had sharp claws and teeth with a long, steel-crushing tail. The young warrior leaped back, drawing out his father's sword, only to find that he and the creature were in a 4-mile radius compound, enclosed by 4 brick walls that were thousands of feet high. The monster then shot out from its mouth a huge ball of fire. Lance in turn sliced through the fiery attack with his enchanted sword, and leaped at the creature with a spinning sword attack. The blade of the young warrior's sword bounced off the creature's exoskeleton, as it was unable to penetrate it. Lance, stopping in a moment of shock, was rammed to the floor by the monster's big head. Lance flipped to his feet, then immediately dropped flat on the ground, avoiding the creature's attacking tail by mere inches. The giant armadillo's tail didn't strike the young warrior. It did, however, create a big hole in one of the walls that enclosed them. Lance, acting quickly, rolled to his feet and dived through the hole created by the monster. The young warrior soon found his decision to be one of great haste, as he found himself on a vast field filled with thousands of giant armadillo monsters. To Lance's great terror, many of the giant monsters began to run towards him. Acting out of sheer desperation, Lance leaped off one of the creature's head onto another's back. A neighboring armadillo struck the monster Lance was standing on in an effort to get at the young warrior. The student of Jacob then leaped off the now tumbling armadillo onto another. The young warrior kept jumping from armadillo to armadillo until many of the monsters on the field began fighting each other. Lance, however, was lucky enough to leap off the back of an attacking monster through a portal that chose to open in the middle of the field. Some beasts refuse to live up to a title. The flash of light passed, and Luke found himself in a rainforest-like scenery. The young warrior looked around and noticed an 8-foot sloth with long, sharp teeth and claws, fast asleep on a nearby tree. The son of Jacob was about to create distance between him and the large beast, when he suddenly noticed the short sword he thought he had lost against his battle with the beowulf lying on the floor. Luke bent down to pick up his weapons, and arose only to find that the sloth was no longer resting on the tree. Luke, suddenly alerted by his sixth sense, ducked quickly just about avoiding the sloth's attacking claw, which in turn took down a tree. The sloth, giving Luke absolutely no time to think, continued attacking viciously with a great deal of speed. The young warrior, mainly relying on reflexes, jumped, rolled, ducked and dived, flipped and somersaulted out of harm's way. That also took the form of falling trees, which took the impact of the creature's attacks instead of him. Luke, seizing the first opportunity, took to the trees and made use of his incredible agility, and began to flee. The determined killer sloth, in turn, began a hot pursuit. After fleeing for about 3 minutes, Luke used his spear-headed chain to latch onto a branch he was approaching and executed a 360-degree swing, causing him to land right behind the monster. The blade of the young warrior's short swords greeted the killer sloth that took and missed a chance to eliminate Luke in the middle of his swing. Before the young warrior could fully witness the creature's death, a flash of light blinded him. One tag team deserves another. After narrowly escaping death for the countless time, the students of Jacob found themselves back to back at the center of a gigantic steel cage, surrounded by cheering little gremlins. "You're alive," said Luke, managing to contain the fact that he was happy to see his comrade. "You say that like it's a bad thing. responded Lance, also hiding the fact that he was relieved to know his brethren was alive. No, it's just that I myself am very lucky to be alive, explained Luke. Gates of the cage on both sides then opened. On the left-hand side walked in a huge beast that was at least 12 feet. It was half man and half mammoth. On the right-hand side, a beast of the same size and stature walked in. It was half man and half rhino. The monster stepped into the arena and the gates behind them closed. The mutant beast then gave out a loud roar before slowly moving in to crush the young warriors. Lance and Luke responded by drawing out their swords, but their plans to finish their large opponents off with their enchanted weapons were short-lived. For one of the cheering gremlins pressed a big red button on the outside of the cage, causing a magnetic field to strip the young warriors off their weapons. "What the?" said Lance as he watched his sword get stuck to the ceiling of the cage. At this point, the beast rushed to ram into the now disarmed warriors. Lance and Luke side-rolled out of harm's way, causing the mutant beasts to ram into each other. The cage shook as both beasts hit the ground hard. "I hope the gateway out of this dimension opens in here," said Lance, assuming the opponents were down and out. But his assumption was soon proved wrong, as both beasts suddenly gained consciousness and got to their feet. "We cannot defeat them without our weapons," pointed out Luke, as the beast charged towards them with another round of attacks. Both warriors ran to opposite sides of the cage, with Lance moving to the right and Luke moving to the left. The mammoth beast tried crashing, ramming, and grabbing Lance, but the young warrior was too quick. Lance tried kicking and punching the beast, but found it did little more than shove the beast. Luke, meanwhile, was in the process of seriously frustrating the rhino beast that tried so hard to attack him in any possible way. At one point, the rhino beast charged right at him. In turn, the young warrior executed a straddle jump over the mutant. As Luke's feet touched the ground, he immediately took to the air and kicked the rhino beast across 10 meters into a side of the cage. As the rhino beast crashed into the cage, it caused considerable damage. So much so, the cage lost the magnetic field holding the weapons on the ceiling, causing them to drop to the ground. Lance made his way to his sword with a series of backflips, and Luke picked up his short sword while executing a butterfly kick. Lance picked up his sword and smiled at his comrade, for they both knew the attacking opponent now faced a certain doom. After each warrior's execution of a lethal weaponry attack, a flash of bright light blinded them. The difference between man and ape. Lance regained his sight, only to find himself in the middle of a desert, bombarded with a relentless heat from the sun. The young warrior looked around, but all he could see was sand and a tall mountain-like structure that was 100 meters up ahead. Responding to a rumbling sound, Student of Jacob turned around only to see an army of killer apes charging towards him. Lance, without even thinking twice, began to run in the opposite direction as fast as he could. As he approached the mountain-like structure, he decided to climb up it, for it seemed futile to keep running in an open desert he knew nothing about. After climbing more than 80 feet, the young warrior finally reached the top, only to find that there was barely enough space on the top for him to stand. Lance looked down, only to find the killer apes climbing up with a level of determination that seemed very disturbing. Lance, now ready to fight until there was no more energy left in his body, drew out his father's sword and began striking down apes before they could complete their climb. After fighting hard for a good 10 minutes, the young warrior noticed a portal open at the side of the structure. Lance then simultaneously struck down half a dozen apes before executing a twisting somersault through the portal. Make good use of all opportunities. Luke found himself standing armed and ready on grassy land at the foot of a hill. Luke didn't move a muscle, for he could somehow sense danger was close. He was right, for he was thrown to the floor as a 20-foot monster burst out of the ground under him. The creature resembled a giant cobra, only it had 4 strong limbs and was covered with spikes. The monster leaped at Luke as he hit the ground, but the young warrior managed to quickly roll out of harm's way, causing the monster to submerge back into the ground. An unsettling silence followed as Luke could not hear or see his attacker. Suddenly, the beast burst out of the hill and right at him. Luke reacted by falling backwards, at the same time slashing the beast across the stomach as he ended up leaping over him. The creature, now wounded, fell to the floor. Luke in turn moved over to the beast and dug the blades of his short swords into its head, causing it to die and allow him to leave the dimension with a flash of white light. A cursed warrior's wrath. Lance suddenly found himself standing on top of a giant silver sphere, made out of an unknown substance, floating over a live volcano. Standing opposite him was a hefty sprite who was about 6 feet in height, and dressed in what seemed to be steel armor from the neck down. As Lance and the sprite made eye contact, the monster ran at the young warrior, who in turn drew out his sword and began to defend himself. The sprite was fast and strong, but Lance kept him at bay with his stepping work and kicking attacks, until he made the decision to strike the beast with his sword, only to find its armor was impenetrable. The sprite, He used this opportunity to disarm the young warrior with one powerful punch. Lance was flung onto his back while the blade of his sword dug into the sphere. The student of Jacob flipped to his feet and took hold of his nunchucks, which he then artistically handled before setting into a kung fu-like stance. The sprite, unfazed by the young warrior's skill, moved in for another round of attacks. Lance, now very focused, countered every one of the beast's attack and struck it continuously in the face with his weapons. After 10 blows to the head, the sprite staggered backwards in a dazed state. Lance, wasting absolutely no time, threw the monster off the sphere with an aerial spin kick. As his feet touched the ground, a flash of bright light blinded him. A shocking opponent. Luke found himself standing in the middle of a large steel room. Standing about 20 feet away from him was a young man of the same height and stature as him. The stranger was dressed in brown rags and had eyes that seemed to have been taken to the depths of insanity and back. The stranger smiled at Luke, who responded by raising an eyebrow. The stranger, with the use of his hands, then suddenly shot out a bolt of electricity at the young warrior, who moved only slightly to dodge the attack. The stranger then widened his grin before firing a series of electrical streams and bolts at Luke, who in turn ran, leaped, jumped and somersaulted around the room to avoid being electrocuted. The master of electricity came close to striking the young warrior in the back with a bolt of electricity, but the student of Jacob just about avoided it by flipping off one of the room's walls. As Luke's feet touched the ground, the electrical stranger blasted the steel floor with electricity, causing the young warrior to be electrocuted. Luke, now weakened by the attack, dropped to his knees. The stranger, who seemed very amused by the young warrior's predicament, confidently approached him. As he came within 5 meters of Luke, their eyes made contact, and in a split second it was made clear to the electrical stranger that there was plenty of fight left in the young warrior. The master of electricity blasted the floor again in an effort to finish off Luke. But before he could effectively harm his opponent, the student of Jacob leaped up and punched his assailant in the neck while in mid-air. The stranger began trying to catch his breath, and Luke decided to show no mercy. The young warrior then struck the electrical stranger with an unforgiving 12-hit combination, which ended with the blade of one of his short swords in his chest. The stranger gave out a loud scream before finally exploding. Sometimes circumstances make the decision for you. Lance found himself on a level cornfield and immediately noticed a dozen vicious Komodo dragons circling an innocent girl who looked no older than 10. As Lance drew out his sword for action, a portal leading out of the dimension opened right beside him. Without even considering abandoning the girl as an option, the young warrior leaped into action and slew as many beasts as he could before grabbing the girl, putting her over his shoulder and running back towards the portal, fleeing the pack of dragons that had now grown from 6 to 16. The gateway leading out of the dimension closed, but Lance kept running. Finally, the student of Jacob found safety in a cave, which had an entrance that was too small for any of the dragons to pass through. No matter what happens to me, I want you to stay here, instructed Lance as he put the girl down. The girl indicated that she would obey with a simple nod of her head. Lance then went back out of the cave and began to slay all the dragons with incredible style and grace. A single strike with his enchanted sword was enough to vanquish a single dragon. In the heat of battle, after slaying 16 dragons, Lance thrust his sword backwards and drove its blade through an attacker before even looking at it. Lance, now confident he had killed all the dragons in the area, turned round only to find he had driven his sword through the girl he had rescued. As the young warrior froze in horror and disbelief, the girl before his eyes morphed into a Komodo dragon, then back into a girl before dropping to the ground dead. Lance then looked around and found instead of being surrounded by the corpses of giant flesh-eating lizards, he was surrounded by the bodies of dead children. Before the young warrior could take in what had just happened, a flash of light blinded him. All it takes is one bite. The light passed, and Luke found himself under a night sky, roaming through an unknown swamp. The young warrior, uncomfortable with where he stood, grabbed hold of a dangling vine and began to climb into a tree above him. As the young warrior climbed into a tree, an unnaturally huge crocodile leaped out after and missed the chance to take a chunk out of him by mere inches. As Luke gained balance and distance in the tree, he managed to catch a glimpse of the large reptile as it dived back into the swamp. An unsettling silence followed, and Luke prepared for battle by drawing out his short swords. Suddenly, the crocodile emerged out of the swamp and destroyed the tree's foundation with one swing of its tail. As Luke fell towards the swamp, the crocodile leaped up towards him with its mouth wide open. Luke, empowered by sheer desperation, in mid-air, managed to manipulate himself into a backward somersault, causing him to move out of harm's way. As the young warrior fell past the determined carnivore, he dug the blades of his short swords into the monster's belly. Luke hit the swamp first, while the now dead crocodile fell towards him. Before the large crocodile could squash the young warrior, a flash of bright light blinded him. They say the tongue can be deadly. Light passed, and Lance found himself near a contaminated pond, under a night sky. Lance drew out his sword, ready to face battle, but was unable to lay his eyes on any threat. Suddenly, a long, slimy tongue wrapped round his legs and dragged him along the grassy floor, towards a razor-sharp, teeth-filled mouth of a demonic frog the size of a rhino. Lance swung his sword at the tongue in an effort to cut himself free, but the monster drew back its tongue before his sword's blade made contact with it. The creature then pounced at the young warrior, who in turn rolled out of the way. The son of Jacob soon found himself displaying many acrobatic moves in an effort to stay clear of the monster's sharp teeth. Lance finally gained enough ground to wield his sword, but before Lance could capitalize on this advantage, the frog wrapped its tongue around his sword's handle and began to pull on it, causing Lance to be dragged along with it. Lance put up a great deal of resistance, but in the end he wasn't strong enough. Lance knew the monster was using a great deal of force to pull on his sword. Because of this, he looked the frog in the eye and smiled. The young warrior then let go of his sword, causing it to shoot right through the creature's head, killing it almost instantly. The son of Sir Nathaniel grabbed hold of his father's sword, right before a flash of light once again blinded him. What a tangled web we weave. The light passed, and Luke found himself stuck on a gigantic spider web, hanging in the middle of complete darkness. The young warrior, who was unable to move both his hands and legs, noticed a huge spider the size of a lion slowly moving towards him. The son of Jacob began to struggle vigorously in an effort to free himself, but his efforts were in vain, for the substance holding him down to the web was too strong. The spider then shot a dart of green acidic liquid at Luke, who in turn managed to avoid it by tilting his head slightly. The liquid ate away at the web holding the young warrior's body, causing him to fall through it into a deep pit and onto a pile of rotting corpses. Luke, with part of his clothes and skin partially burnt, rose to his feet only to sight the giant spider lowering itself down with a string of web, at the same time continuously shooting darts of green acidic liquid. Luke began to defend himself by stopping the acid attacks with his short swords and leaping up into the air, where he decapitated the creature with one swipe of one of his short swords. As his feet touched back down on the rotting corpses, a flash of bright light blinded him. Sometimes you have to make the first move. Lance regained his sight, only to find himself in an underground maze lit up by burning sticks placed on the walls. Lance, in an effort to find his way out, began to wander around the caves and tunnels. After an hour of walking, the young warrior came to a dead end, where he saw a giant demonic hedgehog fast asleep. Lance's initial reaction was to sneak away, but this was immediately short-lived as he heard the sound of an interdimensional portal open behind him. The young warrior turned around, only to find the portal had opened right behind the creature. "Damn!" cried out Lance by sheer reflex, as his frustration got the better of him. As his voice echoed throughout the maze, the monster woke up and rose to its feet. "Oops," said Lance, realizing his mistake as he drew out his sword for battle. Lance, assuming the creature would pounce at him, had already begun to visualize himself rolling under the monster and jumping through the portal. The monster, however, took Lance by surprise and began to shoot dozens of spikes at the young warrior from off its back. Lance in turn used his sword and agility to block and dodge the spikes. By the time the son of Sir Nathaniel got himself together, the creature had seemed to use up all its spikes, and the portal was now closed. The beast then stood upright in an ape-like manner and unleashed a pair of long, sharp claws. The creature then began to attack the warrior with speed and strength. Lance, utilizing his sword's potential, defended himself with style and grace. The creature was powerful and ruthless, but in the end, Lance's will, heart, and sheer skill prevailed. Making good use of his first opportunity, the young warrior destroyed the beast by literally splitting it in two. After delivering the killing blow, Lance rotated his sword back into his favorite fighting stance, and a bright flash of light followed. "Run!" Luke regained his sight, only to find himself standing on the north side of an exotic jungle. The young warrior then heard buzzing sounds, and sighted a swarm of killer bees, feasting on the meat of a dead carcass at an incredible rate. The swarm of killer bees, which was obviously carnivorous, fed on the corpse until only the bones were left. The young warrior then began to run through the jungle in an effort to create distance between him and the bees. The bees, already with a scent of his flesh, followed. Luke was a fast and agile runner, but slowly and surely the bees began to catch up with him. The demonized insects were in biting rage when suddenly the young warrior fell down a muddy hill. Luke got to his feet quickly, only to face a new problem that took the form of a fully grown Tyrannosaurus. With a well-timed roll, Luke was able to avoid the monster's eager teeth, get to his feet, and run. Meanwhile, 2,000 meters south on the same area, Lance found himself in a rocky desert area. The young warrior walked just over 1,000 meters when a giant winged lizard swooped down in an effort to take a chunk out of him. The young warrior was lucky enough to avoid the unseen attack with a simple reflex duck. Soon afterwards, the winged lizard was in hot pursuit of the son of Sir Nathaniel. The students of Jacob unwittingly found themselves running towards each other in an open grassland, which linked the two sides of the dimension. Both of the students avoided the attacks of their pursuers with well-placed rolls and leaps while running. A portal then opened in the middle of the grassland, and both warriors jumped through it from opposite sides before even catching a glimpse of one another. Ying! Luke fell onto the floor of a large, spacious temple. The young warrior got to his feet and sighted the Yao armor that took the form of a blue metallic-looking ninja suit placed on a stage-like platform above 3 steps. The young warrior made a move to approach the armor, but was floored by the force of 2 powerful kicks, one in the stomach and one in the face. Luke recovered quickly and flipped to his feet and came face to face with his attacker, a slim, bald Caucasian man dressed in black, who advertised the leg he used to attack by keeping it raised. Luke, wasting no time, took the fight to his assailant. The young warrior fought valiantly in his usual artistic manner. In terms of skill and speed, both men were evenly matched. However, it seemed the guardian of the temple had a slight advantage over the student of Jacob. Luke managed to get in a few punches and kicks, but they all seemed to have absolutely no effect. On the other side of the equation, Luke was very much affected by the hits he received. After receiving a 5-hit combination of punches and kicks, Luke was struck to the ground by a somersaulting dropkick. The guardian then leaped into the air in an effort to finish the dazed warrior with a head stomp. Luke quickly responded by spinning to his feet, during which he countered his opponent's aerial attack with a solid kick. As Luke got to his feet, the guardian hit the ground back first. It became clear to the sharp young warrior that his opponent could only be hurt while in mid-air. The guardian, taking a more acrobatic approach, moved in for a second round of attacks. Luke, now very aware of his opponent's weakness, confidently avoided all of his attacks and took the first opportunity to leg sweep him off the floor and strike him with a powerful side kick before his body had a chance to hit the ground. The force of Luke's kick violently flung the guardian through one of the temple's walls. The guardian got to his feet filled with rage and attacked Luke, this time taking his speed and strength up a notch. Luke tried to tame the guardian's ruthless aggression, but in the end, it proved to be too much for him. The young warrior ended up being on the receiving end of a 15-hit combination of punches, elbows, throws, and kicks, after which the guardian took his right arm and popped it out of its socket. Luke was then thrown to the floor by a gravity-defying scissors kick. The young guardian then leaped up into the air to finish him off with a somersaulting axe kick, but was stopped by a desperate response. Luke put an end to the guardian's attack by throwing one of his short swords at him, which in turn dug into the guardian's chest, causing him to fall to the ground hard. The guardian then got to his feet in an effort to defy death's calling. Luke in turn popped his arm back into his shoulder and allowed the pain to fuel an aerial horizontal spin, from which he unleashed a devastating kick that pushed his short sword right through the guardian, killing him instantly. After catching his breath, the young warrior staggered towards the Yao armor and slowly put it on. The armor in turn began to glow and became a blue bodysuit on him. At this point, all his physical pain and injuries disappeared, and his speed, agility, and skill increased by 1,000-fold, for he had suddenly become enlightened to the secrets of all the soft elements of combat. Yang! Meanwhile, Lance also found himself falling into the hall of a temple, which was only slightly different from the temple that held the Yao armor. In this temple, the red Gong armor was kept on a platform above 6 steps. The young warrior drew out his sword and slowly approached the armor, knowing very well that something or someone would be guarding it. Suddenly, a huge muscular man with rough ebony-colored skin came smashing through one of the temple walls, armed with a sword that made totally out of flames. The huge guardian of the temple thrust his sword at the young warrior, who quickly responded by jumping and blocking his attack with the enchanted sword once held by the hands of his father. The young warrior then began to engage the guardian in a vicious sword fight. The guardian was powerful, and his sword cut through marble, concrete, and steel like a hot knife through butter, as Lance quickly discovered while avoiding the fury of his opponent's attacks. After a good 15 minutes of serious battling, Lance's skill as a swordsman began to take center stage and allowed him to strike the guardian across the chest and back. But to his intense disbelief and horror, his sword wasn't even able to make a scratch on his opponent. With his spirit now discouraged by his opponent's resistance to an enchanted blade, Lance began to find it more and more difficult to counter his opponent's merciless attacks. The guardian then began to get the better of Lance, and the young warrior soon found himself just inches away from being chopped into little pieces by his assailant's fiery sword. Out of sheer desperation, Lance, with the use of his sword, manipulated the guardian's sword into a circular motion and slashed him across the eyes with his own sword. This caused the guardian to drop his sword and stagger back. Out of sheer determination to destroy the only obstacle standing between him and the Gong armor, Lance grabbed hold of the guardian's sword, which immediately began to burn his hand. Taking the burning pain of holding the guardian's fiery sword, Lance swung the sword at his blind assailant, screaming, and in turn sliced him into 2 clean halves. As the guard embraced total annihilation, his sword of flames turned into dust. The pain of his severely burned hand caused Lance to drop to his knees. After dedicating a couple of seconds to calming down, the young warrior got to his feet and wore the Gong armor. On him, it became a red bodysuit and took away all his injuries. His strength and stamina increased 1,000 folds, for his eyes were opened to the secret of all the hard elements of combat. One more thing. There was a flash of light, and both warriors found themselves standing in the middle of a white limbo-like environment, right in front of Bequil. "You made it," said the boys in unison, then hugging each other. "We've got the armors. Can we go now?" said Lance, addressing Bequil. "Not so fast. You still have one more obstacle to pass," informed the keeper. "Bring it on. We're more than prepared," said Lance, overconfident in the abilities of the armors they now possessed. "I'm glad you feel that way," said Bequil, then morphing into a 10-foot werewolf-like creature. "Wow, someone's been eating their vegetables," said Lance, unfazed by the guy's transformation. Bequil then proceeded to dish out some vicious attacks that seemed to vibrate the air each time they missed. Luke, taking complete control of the situation, began frustrating the creature by comfortably redirecting the force of all its attacks. He then used the monster's own force to push it into one of Lance's earthquaking blows, which for Bequil seemed to stop time itself. "This isn't personal," said Lance, then finishing off the keeper with a bone-shattering uppercut. That is the end of episode 19, but before you go, answer this episode's question. Did the success the boys have in the gauntlet make Luke's decision to enter the gauntlet as individuals instead of a team right? Refer to the Bible and leave your answers via any of JOMAJ Studios' social media platforms, which can be found at jomajstudios.com. Like Water, The Next Age is now available on paperback and in ebook format via any Kindle device. Also, check out the JOMAJ Studio website, Twitter page, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube channel for the complete Like Water series and all other JOMAJ Studio features.